Thank you for coming. Welcome to the IISS. My name's Dana Allen. I'm a senior fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy and Transatlantic Affairs here. I'm also editor of our journal, Survival. We have an office in Singapore, and if you've ever flown in and seen the tankers lined up in the Strait of Malacca, you can appreciate that it's an excellent observation post for issues of maritime security and economic and energy markets. And we're very pleased to have our senior fellow, our Sultan Bolkiah Senior Fellow in Economic and Energy Security, based in our Singapore office, Dr. Pierre Noël. His research focuses include energy market dynamics and policy challenges in Southeast Asia, natural gas markets, seaborne energy trade and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, and he's been working a great deal recently on the energy causes and implications of the Ukraine crisis. Prior to coming to the IISS a couple of years ago, Pierre was a senior research associate with the Energy Policy Research Group at the Judge Business School at Cambridge University. And he has had a postdoctoral career as a research fellow at IFRI in Paris. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Grenoble. And he's here to talk to us about the topic of the security of oil trade routes and the cost of maritime security. So, Pierre, the floor is yours, or the seat is yours.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. It's always good to sometimes come to the headquarters and take the opportunity to meet new audience. I spend all of my time, most of my time in Singapore, and a lot of it is, as Dana alluded to, spent on issues that at the intersection between shipping, maritime security, and energy markets. So, what I'm going to present today is a very specific take on this broad and large topic. We've done some work as part of a broader research project. I led some research on, trying to see if you could put a price tag, an economic figure, on maritime insecurity for energy importers in Asia. There's, of course, as you know, a lot of discussions about maritime insecurity in Asia, towards Asia. The security landscape is changing both within Asia and in regions that are relevant for Asian energy supply, primarily the Middle East. I'm going to address that briefly as the first part of my talk. And the strategic community, and I'm not quite sure I'm part of that, and maybe I've got a foot in it since I joined IISS, the strategic community considers that to be a huge issue. And what I thought I would do is, if it's a huge issue, there must be a way of tracing the importance of this issue through economic indicators. And I took advantage of a large grant we got from the MacArthur Foundation to lead some sort of an aspect, a project within the project, if you want, to try and do some economic work on this. And we did two things, which are going to be the main part of the talk, so it's under number 2 here. We looked at the cost of insuring Asian energy imports under various scenarios of maritime insecurity in Asia, but also in the Middle East, for cargoes and tankers and so on that are heading towards Asia. And another research project looked at various pieces of infrastructure that have been built or are considered or could be, in principle, considered that would reduce the reliance of Asian energy importers to seaborne, to maritime security risks. And here we're talking about pipelines that allow Middle East oil, for example, to reach export markets without sailing through the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz on the one hand, but you're also talking about the pipeline that China built across Myanmar to feed their refinery in Yunnan, new large refinery in Yunnan, without relying on the Strait of Malacca and sailing through the South China Sea. There are other projects that are discussed in the literature and the policy circles, maybe the equivalent of that through Pakistan. So this kind of can be looked at, if you want, a bit rigorously, if you can work on how much it costs to build those things. So that's what we did. The first part of the talk is very general. It's just to introduce to the changing security environment within Asia, but also in the Middle East, which is highly relevant, of course, for Asian energy supply. But anything that I could tell you about that, most of you would know at least as well as I do, and certainly for many of you much better. So please forgive me if your expertise is better than mine, but just very briefly, the security environment in the Middle East is changing because of the nuclear deal with Iran, which of course has to be considered as a positive development, but is triggering a dynamics that may be destabilizing as well. So there's some sort of a paradox here. The Saudi-Iranian confrontation is actually much more open since the deal was signed, because Saudi interests were actually more or less hiding behind U.S. interests as long as the U.S.-Iranian confrontation was going on. The deal makes this Cold War, so to speak, some people use this phrase, less cold, and we're seeing that in the news now all the time. The other big force that's changing the security environment in the Middle East is the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, everything that's linked to that, the inclusion of the civil war in Syria and the enduring instability in Iraq. I mean, all of that is connected. This is not my field. I'm not going to say more about that. But clearly, what is of interest to me is that these dynamics create new or reinforce existing threats to either the internal stability of the Gulf monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, or actually create new external threats for them. That is relevant for the type of things that I do and I care about, because whatever risk was reduced as far as, for example, the Gulf of Hormuz, security of the Gulf of Hormuz is concerned by the deal with Iran, may actually have been compensated by an increased risk of potential major large-scale oil supply disruption because of an increased risk of regional conflict, or because of an increased risk of Saudi regime destabilization. So, not more on that, but just to say that the security situation in the Middle East amply justifies looking at what it means for energy shipping and therefore energy supply security for those who rely on energy markets, especially Asia. In Asia, the dynamics is the security environment is also changing quite profoundly, and by Asia or Asian waters, of course I mean primarily the South China Sea. Most of you, again, would know more than me on this, but the rise of China has ceased to be something that's, in the background, primarily about economic trends. It's now very much front and center, and it's not only economic trends, it's really profound change in the balance of power in the region, including military capabilities. There's now a very clear challenge being mounted by China against the status quo in the South China Sea with the building of the artificial islands and the very likely militarization of those artificial islands, which I am told by people who know about that, my colleagues at the office in Singapore and others, that this will be a very significant change to the security situation, the geostrategic situation of the region. I think this Chinese challenge, to be very clear from the beginning, does not create direct threats to the security of commercial shipping, energy shipping, or otherwise. But it creates a risk, an increased risk of confrontation between either the United States or regional powers, or both, over these claims and the broader attempt by China of, over time, being recognized as the primary security guarantor of shipping across the South China Sea. So here again, ample justification for looking at the link between maritime insecurity and energy supply security. So let's go into the meat of the talk, I would say. And what I'm presenting today is just a few, I would say, of the more maybe interesting results of this project. There's going to be publications out of this project where things are going to be presented in much greater details. This is really a summary of the findings that I'm presenting today. So let's start with the first of those two research papers, research projects, the one on insurance. Is it possible to quantify the insurance cost insurance extra cost that's brought about by increased insecurity in Asian waters and in the waters of the Middle East, on which Asia relies for its energy? Well, I think it is, and we try to do it. So the first step is to characterize the reliance on imports, and especially on seaborne imports. Asian economies are highly reliant on seaborne energy imports for oil, liquefied natural gas, and coal. The rate of reliance on imports, this thing doesn't seem to be working, but it's not a big problem, can be translated into a number of shipments. So for example, you see that China, so these are 2013 figures, China imported about 1,000 shipments, 1,000 very large crude carriers per year in 2013. So in terms of rate of reliance, they are much lower than other countries in the region, but the absolute quantities are much bigger. So that translates into, so again, there are simplifications and assumptions behind that, but this can be done and has to be done to calculate the risk. Then what we did is we looked at how the shipping insurance market works, and we devised scenarios of increased risk like we have two different levels of risk. I'm going to talk only about the higher risk scenario here. And what happens is when you have a situation where maritime insecurity increases, the shipping insurance market starts to apply additional war risk premium. So war risk insurance is a very normal part of the industry. It's very, very cheap to insure against war risk, but it's cheap when there's no risk. So when the risk goes up, they start charging additional premium, and this is where it can rapidly become meaningful. So in our high risk scenario, we have additional war risk premium of 1% of both hull value and cargo value. That corresponds, for those of you who would be, might be familiar with that, this corresponds to a very high level of risk, but one that does not prevent commercial shipping from continuing. Of course, in the region, and as we shall see, this is of course one of the big differences with the Middle East, you can go around the South China Sea. You don't have to sail through the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea. So we calculated the extra cost for the shipping industry to reach East Asia without going through Malacca and the South China Sea. And we had to make heroic assumptions about the freight rates, but we were very conservative. We used extremely expensive freight rates. Like, at the moment, the freight market is completely depressed, so the rates that we used look extremely expensive in the current environment, and this was done on purpose to be more on the conservative and the safe side. If anything, the costs that we find out would be higher than the real world cost of rerouting through the Lombok Strait and east of the Philippines. So in such a situation where the entire South China Sea fetches additional war risk premium of 1%, what does it mean for Asian energy importers? This is the question we equipped ourselves to answer. One of the key takeaways is that rerouting makes a big difference. So it's a bit of a shame that this doesn't work. Maybe I'm doing the wrong thing, I don't know. Anyway, the ability to reroute brings the cost from the big bar here to the tall bar to the medium one. Indeed, these are two. The dark blue bars are, in both cases, high-risk scenarios. One without rerouting options, and the other one with the rerouting option. As you can see, for Japan, for example, you bring the additional insurance costs from about 7 billion a year to less than 4. So this is very significant. The other thing that you may that certainly I took away from that is that the absolute numbers look big. I mean, 7 billion a year looks like a big number, but if you bring that, as a percentage of the value of the energy that's transported, this is actually very small. And we're talking about a scenario where you have 1%. It's not often that insurers, underwriters would charge additional war risk premium of 1%. This requires a high level of risk, and even that increases corresponds to a security premium, if you want, of about 1% for oil and gas, and less than that, maybe even for some countries, half of a percent for total energy imports. And we're talking about commodities, the price of which has just declined by 70% in 18 months. So these are commodity markets with wide, swings in prices, and you're talking here about between 0.5% and 1% difference. So can we perhaps take questions at the end, if you don't mind, unless we want to do otherwise, Dana?
Question would be good to wait.
Questions at the end. Okay. So that's for Asia, and so now we did the same in the Middle East. Of course, all the quantitative assumptions are the same, but of course there's no rerouting. You cannot sail around the Gulf. You have to go through it, and we did it in a way that you can't. If you want to sail through it, you have to pay. If you want to get energy out of the Gulf, you have to pay the additional risk or risk premium, except for the extra capacity in the pipeline that we're going to hear about later on across Saudi and now across the UAE to Fujairah, which is just outside of the high risk area here, very conveniently. So the cost for Asian importers is comparable to the risk scenario over Malacca and the South China Sea, except of course for India, because India relies a lot on the Gulf and not at all on the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea. Comparable to Southeast Asia with rerouting, but much less than Southeast Asia without rerouting for most countries. The other exercise that we thought was interesting to do is to try and calculate the economic value of pipelines that would allow Asian countries to reduce their exposure to maritime risk. Because, if these risks are important, then the value of something that reduces the risk must be important as well. And this is not what we found. What we found is that, and we're going to look at pipelines in the Middle East and then the pipeline across Myanmar. What we found is that these pipelines are not economical as security policies, as insurance, if you want. So we did quite a bit of economic and financial analysis to try and build a financial model of those investments. I mean, these are very significant pieces of infrastructure. There is some publicly available data, but not enough. So we had to do a lot of extrapolations from pipeline projects built elsewhere in the world for part of the project. I mean, we did it as rigorously as we could, but of course there are assumptions that may be debated. One very important aspect of that is that contrary to the insurance paper that I've talked before, here the market responds. So when the security crisis strikes, which here we consider to be the inability to get oil and gas, it's not only about oil, to get oil out of the Middle East, out of the Gulf, then the price of oil, of course, spikes. The price of oil spikes, and that triggers the use of strategic petroleum reserves. So we factored into the model the strategic petroleum reserves. And here again, we had to make assumptions, because they've never been used at scale to face a real, very large emergency situation. But that is extremely important, because, of course, the value of this thing relies on the ability of Saudi and the UAE to continue getting their oil to the market when the price spikes. This is where you pay back, if you want, your security investment, right? You have periods of extremely high prices and you're able to get your oil to the market. But the very purpose of the strategic petroleum reserves is to dampen the price spike. So one of the key things that we got from this exercise is that because energy importers have already paid for quite a lot of insurance through, in the form of strategic petroleum reserves, it doesn't pay for energy exporter to add another layer of insurance through bypassing pipelines. So the numbers are, I think, less interesting than the explanation. But basically, the higher the oil price, the lower are your losses. But in any case, they're losing money. This is the net present value of the Saudi and Emirati pipeline, respectively, over 30 years. So there's not enough benefits from using these pipelines during the disruption. Of course, a very big assumption we made is we had to define the emergency situation, and we took one major crisis over a period of 30 years. So it's 30 days of total inability to bring the oil to the market once in 30 years. As I will say at the end, we're doing now sensitivity analysis to see how the value of the pipeline changes when you change this assumption. You change the number of emergencies and the length of emergencies. But basically, they're losing money. This is never economical under those circumstances. China built this pipeline here. It's a bit thinner in the real world than this big line here. It's very interesting. I mean, this is a purely transit pipeline. There's no oil from Myanmar that is actually exported to China. So they built a brand new oil terminal in Myanmar. The tankers go through the Bay of Bengal, and instead of sailing to southern China via the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea, they unload the oil over there, and this oil is then pumped to China, where there is a big refinery and petrochemical complex. There is a joint investment with Saudi Aramco for at least part of it. So here there's the same financial analysis we had to do to be able to assess the economics of that. Here, of course, we looked at it from the point of view of China. So it's an importing country that invests in reducing its exposure to the risk. It's not like in the Middle East, an exporter that wants to be able to export during an emergency. So it's not economical. The import cost is there's an additional import cost, but there's also a negative impact on the consumer surplus. The drivers here, exactly like one of them is exactly like for insurance. The fact that you can reroute through Lombok actually destroys some of the value of avoiding, almost by definition. It's completely intuitive, avoiding the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait. But actually, much more important is the size of the pipeline. The pipeline is much too small, way too small, to make a difference when you cannot sail through the South China Sea. So that we're doing sensitivity analysis here on the size of the pipeline and the availability of Lombok. So we constrain Lombok and we build a bigger pipeline through. We expand the capacity of the pipeline to see if it can be economical as a security policy under other assumptions. So the conclusions are just basically a recap. The security environment is changing, and even though there's a kind of there's a renewed sense of optimism and security, optimism about energy security that's brought about by very structural fundamental factors, but this improved long-term security is actually quite disconnected from the short-term security, which might be deteriorating because of the security dynamics in the Middle East and in Asia. What we found is that even under high levels of maritime insecurity, the security premiums for Asian importers are relatively small and perhaps even, we could say very small. Bypassing Malacca and the South China Sea through the pipelines across Myanmar and perhaps one day Pakistan is not worth it. We're testing other assumptions to be more comprehensive at the moment for the paper. And similarly, bypassing the Gulf of Hormuz is not economical under our assumptions. And there's a very interesting interaction between the strategic petroleum reserve that importers have paid for, continue to pay for, and these pipelines that exporters either have paid for or are willing to pay for. And here also we are expanding the analysis to be a bit more comprehensive. So the last thing to do is to mention again the funding by the MacArthur Foundation, and also to acknowledge my brilliant research assistants and former colleague in Cambridge, Shikong Chong, who was very involved in the second paper that I've talked about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. That's fascinating, and it's fascinating for me in particular as someone who is, completely focused on politics and security and not really on economics and energy. The room has been configured as though I'm going to interview you, so I will ask at least one question, but I understand somebody else the audience wants to get in. That very thick red line from Myanmar is puzzling based on your analysis. And I used to go to China, not frequently, but enough to talk about these issues. And they seem to have what one would at least call a non-economical or a non-economics-based concept of energy security. And I just wonder if you could explain that. I mean, I guess the obvious explanation, or the only explanation that makes sense, is they're insuring themselves against a war with the United States, and the assumption that the United States would actually be in a position to cut off their energy supplies. Is that all we're talking about, and the only way it makes sense?
I don't think so. The way I make sense of this pipeline is that it probably was the cheapest way of supplying this particular refinery and petrochemical complex that they're building. And the size of the pipeline is dimensioned for that, and not as a security policy, precisely as our analysis clearly shows. Because you can say one of two things, but not both. If they believe in this, if they believed in it as a security policy, they would have built a big pipeline.
Right.
And if they don't believe in it as a security policy, then they're doing it for another reason. I mean, if they build a small pipeline, because they're not stupid, in terms of engineering and they know as well as I do, and probably much better, what type of pipes they need to build to make a difference in an emergency. And so my assumption is that when we calculated, and we did that very precisely, and as precisely as we could, we compared the cost of shipping through this pipeline, the total cost that includes the financing of the pipeline, everything, and the cost of sailing through Malacca to Guangzhou, and then shipping across China to the very same place. And actually, shipping through Myanmar seems to be about 20 plus % more expensive. But frankly, given the level of, given the data that we were able to access, this is within the margin of error, right? So my what the conviction that I got from this work is that this was simply a sensible way of supplying this refinery given where it's located. Now, there was another aspect to your question, which is this tension within China, or the Chinese decision-making circles, institutions, between two very different conceptions of energy security. One which is based on, trying to assess the risks of those commodity markets and buy some, sensible level of insurance through various policies and measures, basically doing what, we've been doing for a very long time in the OECD, which China is doing. And another conception, another approach to that, which is much more about our energy security policy must allow us to go through, to go through a warlike situation with the United States, as you and I think, and I think within China you have different people who would who would lean primarily towards one of those conceptions or the other. Certainly, in terms of what China is doing, they're certainly doing the first thing, and they, whether they are doing the other one is a matter of interpretation. But just to finish on this, we have to keep in mind that China is a fairly large oil producer itself. If it was in OPEC, it would be the second largest producer after Saudi. Right? So if they really were in a war situation, they could very easily meet their military needs just with their own production. It's a completely different situation from Japan, for example. But they would also be able to go way beyond that. Beyond their strictly military needs. Plus, of course, you would have to assume that Russia is cooperating with the United States in a blockade, if you're in this kind of scenario, which is a heroic assumption in the current geopolitical situation. Plus, of course, you would have to assume that China cannot do what Germany did in the war, which is to liquefy their coal, which is a technology that they already employ at a very large scale in China and that they can ramp up very quickly. I really do not, it's very difficult for me to conceive of a credible situation where China would have to face an oil blockade in a war situation.
Very interesting. Thank you. Now, there was someone who wanted to ask a question earlier. Who was that? Or did your time pass? Okay, yeah, sure.
I'm not sure we need the microphone.
Can you identify yourself, please?
Sure. Caroline from Gatehouse. Caroline Beck from Gatehouse. It was a question about the table and how you had categorized the risk, but I think I got there, so thank you very much. My question was really, having heard the rest of your talk, if you could say a little bit more about the premise for your research and what led you to take this tack. It's very interesting, and I would just be very interested to hear more about the assumptions that you were making around the importance of this issue and the insecurity itself that led you to try and draw some economic conclusions. And if your conclusions are it's not actually that much more expensive, would you be then looking to do follow-on research in other scenarios?
Yeah, can I just add to that? I was going to ask you went a little bit into your definition of insecurity. You talked about, you had a very specific definition in the Persian Gulf. Is the effect of, for example, piracy so compared to these volumes and these values just so trivial that it's not part of your definition? Because I gathered you were talking about military conflict in both cases.
Yes, the great thing is we don't have to define where the problem comes from. The only thing we have to define is what is the how it manifests itself. So in one case, underwriters start charging additional war risk premiums.
Right.
We don't really have to decide whether it's because China and the United States or there are tensions in the South China Sea or whatever. We didn't have to do it, which is great because, of course, as soon as you do these scenarios, people criticize them and so on. In the Gulf, the way it manifests itself is just you can't get the energy out, whatever the reason. We didn't have to say Iran is blockading, blocking the strait or whatever. We don't have to do that. Piracy, yes, there's a lot of talk about the resurgence of piracy in Southeast Asia, which is actually more robbery at sea, if I understand correctly, the legal definitions, because it's not in international waters. But this concerns almost exclusively local transits, small, relatively small tankers who carry mostly refined products across the region, and those attacks happen in the waters of Indonesia or Malaysia. This so far has had absolutely no impact on intercontinental energy trade, which is what I'm interested in. That said, we had to look in some details at the Horn of Africa piracy episode, because this is one of the major situations where underwriters actually started, charging additional war risk premiums. So we looked at that because we wanted to understand how much they charged for that and how it evolved over time. So at the beginning they were charging very high premiums, but then you had more companies supplying armed guards. The market worked its magic, and the cost of actually reducing the risk went down. So the ability of insurers to extract premiums went down. So we had, this is fascinating to study, to understand how the insurance market works, but it's not directly relevant to what we've done in terms of risk. So where am I in my answer? There was two.
No, I'm afraid I hijacked the original question. Was it answered, or? I hijacked the original question. Did you get a adequate answer to your question? Or?
I think what I had in mind is, given that you seem to be interested in having more details, the best I can do is to share the paper with you, before it's published, but after it's finished, and you will have everything you possibly can want. Is that good?
Right here. There's a microphone coming.
Thanks. My name is Sally Leavesley, and my field is catastrophic risk. I spent some years with one of the global companies in Australia, sort of working on petrochemicals, oil, gas, coal, but not in the detail in your field. I just want to throw in a couple of factors that starts to look at the interest for the insurance sector, because always these players take a very long-term view. It's 15 to 20 years. We have to really look ahead to really define policies for some of the areas you're talking about. So with global security, the logic is, how is this going to evolve over 15 to 20 years, which then starts to create immediately now the planning with some of the global companies. Two things. One is we saw in Western Ukraine the beginning of cyber warfare in terms of interference with energy production. And that type of malware can be applied to pipelines, ports, shipping. But I think shipping will, if we see the big countries as well as the small players bringing in the cybersphere over 15 to 20 years, I think shipping may remain much more flexible than some of the pipelines and some of the other assets. But the problem is, and the factor in the modelling is, the insurance sector has not got a maturity in its cyber market. Mm-hmm. So one wonders how the insurance sector is going to deal with this other factor coming in, which is quite strategic because it can impact on all forms of transportation and production of energy.
Yes, I think what you're alluding to is risk that may be well characterized, well defined, but for which there's no market, there's no insurance market, there's no market, there's no product to insure against them, well, in the type of risk that we're looking at, those products do exist, except I would say the real war situations, because what insurers call war risk insurance is a bit of a misnomer, because actually it doesn't allow you to sail through a war zone. Nobody will insure you for that. What it does is it insures you against all type of violence, I would say, violent acts in peacetime. So it's war risk insurance is for peacetime. It's kind of, it's bizarre. But nonetheless, this market is very well developed and so what can I'm not an expert in the fields that you've highlighted, cyber risk. I completely believe you that the insurance market may be way behind, in terms of being able to provide covers for that, and that may create a very interesting market failure that perhaps could be, at least temporarily, would have to be met by some kind of government intervention. But I'm out of my depth. I listen to you. It's interesting, but it's not my field, really.
Thanks, sir.
David Howell from the House of Lords. So just for my question, I have to say that last question is absolutely fascinating, because what we've now discovered very recently, but very powerfully, is that, of course, that sophisticated cyber warfare can screw up every conceivable kind of shipping, transportation of energy and other fuels, energy and other products, and that this really is emerging as the major risk. And it's fascinating that the insurance company and the analysis now hasn't really sort of caught up with what is the biggest risk now. But my question was a different one. Are we not in danger of missing the woods for the trees in all this discussion? The bigger picture is that 196 countries, including many of the ones you've referred to in Southeast Asia, have all signed up to the phasing out completely by 2050 or maybe by 2070, so the next 35, 55 years, of all hydrocarbons, all coal, all oil, all gas. That is what they've signed up to. Of course, it doesn't match what is really happening, but nevertheless, there are huge changes coming in the entire pattern of international energy and maritime energy change, and they'll probably come much quicker than we realize. One that could come literally overnight, if Mr. Shinzo Abe gets his ways in Japan, is suddenly they could cease to be the most enormous consumers and importers of oil and gas and go back to their pattern they had when they were running a bigger nuclear program. They could restore it. The nuclear station's already built. It's not a question of building them. They could literally switch back, and vast reduction would then take place in the seagoing trade of oil and gas, and frozen gas. That would make and all these are huge developments on the East Asia, on the Central and East Asia and Indian Ocean energy trade, which I didn't really sort of hear from you when you were talking, and yet they're going to be absolutely decisive in working out what the risks are, what investment you're going to make in new VLCCs or not, in new switching stations and ports and all the rest. There's a huge bigger picture there, and I'd just like to hear your references to it.
Well, it's how shall I put it? If this industry disappears, I mean, the risk to the industry become irrelevant. I mean, they disappear with the industry. I mean, you know, it's. I'm not quite convinced that anybody signed to phasing out fossil fuels by any date, but what is clear is that there are very powerful forces that are, I would say, incentivize the world, I would say, to move out of fossil fuels as quickly as is economically sensible, or let's say as soon as possible. But governments will do it, let's say, as quickly as economically sensible. And some countries in Asia may actually be the last to really move out of fossil fuels. But it doesn't invalidate what you say. But frankly, I think it's a completely different topic. You know, if seaborne energy trade shrinks by 50% in the next 30 years, you know, let's assume that, you know, the energy revolution takes off faster than people expect, which is possible. This trade shrinks by 50% over 30 years. Well, I mean, then the risk, all of that becomes irrelevant. But at the moment, it is relevant.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, it's helpful for the people in the back, so.
Hi, Anthony Lahal, member here and researcher, independent researcher. What would happen to, this is a purely hypothetical, theoretical question, but if a huge tanker, especially one with liquefied gas, were to be blown up in going through the Straits of Malacca, and it happened more than once, and you had groups threatening to do that on a regular basis, then what would happen to the cost?
Did you say it happened more than once?
If it did happen more than once.
If
there were repeated attacks, I guess.
A series of attacks, and like, for example, an ISIS-inspired offshoot in the Philippines where you've already got a...
Well, you have to realize these are very sensitive markets. You would not require even a single ship to be blown up for the insurance premium to go through the roof. You really just require perhaps not one attack, but, you know, a small number of, you know, repeated attacks against either VLCCs or LNG carriers in the Strait of Malacca. I mean, that would be more than enough for the insurance industry to qualify the zone as a high risk area and start charging for that. And this is exactly the type of scenarios we've worked on. Exactly that. Now, it is not easy to blow up an LNG tanker. It requires quite a lot of energy, because if you drill a hole into it, it just leaks like that. If you want it to really blow up, you need a missile, essentially. You need to bring a lot of energy to it. But that's you really do not require that to jack up the insurance premium. You need much less than that.
Yes.
Hi, Alia Mubayed from Barclays. So I'm trying to better understand. I mean, very interesting analysis. So I'm sure, I don't know to what extent also you've interacted with government to test some of these hypotheses, but I'm just trying to walk through what would be the implication to policy. I mean, whether on the importer's side or on the exporter's side, under various scenarios of security risk. And I'm in particular interested, of course, in the Middle East, but if you have also comments on Asia, I'd appreciate.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. The reality is that oil or energy importing and large energy consuming countries have integrated insecurity in their energy policy for a very long time. They've integrated the risks. So I've mentioned the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is like a direct tool to address an emergency. But much more structurally, we've been taxing oil products to a very high level for a very long time. And of course, over time, it has very significantly reduced the dependence of our GDP to oil, and those things are not linear. We one day, and then we go back to the question that was asked before. One day electrification of transport, takes off, and then you could really significantly reduce your and this is exactly the goal of our policy. So we've done that for a long time. That said, if there was a big event, I think it would. Some countries could do quite drastic, could have responses that go far beyond addressing the problem itself. If there was there never was one, but if there was a really serious, like 30 days total disruption of Middle East exports, it would do more than I think the response from the world, but especially from the OECD and China, would be probably invest a lot of money to drastically accelerate the diversification of the transport system away from oil. You would see this kind of structural response to a localized, to a discrete event because of its magnitude and impact. In Asia, so maybe you'd have to look at China. And if there was really a serious episode of heightened risk to shipping, to commercial shipping in the South China Sea, here again, we go back to Dana's question at the very beginning. Maybe they would revisit some of their oil security policies and build even more, maybe a resilience and security in the system than they have already. Plus what I've already said, which more of a structural energy policy response, where you, because of a discrete security emergency, you decide that you want to do away with the problem once and for all, and you do some kind of a crash program to significantly reduce your reliance on those commodities over a period of time.
Well, thank you very much. We're in overtime, so I think I should probably draw it to a close. I have this idea in my head, but I need confirmation that there's something in the back. Okay, so I'm pleased to welcome you invite you for some wine, if that's what I assume is back there, and we can continue our discussion that way. But in the meantime, I hope you'll thank me and help and join me in thanking Pierre for this part of the evening.
Thank you.